Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Carmen Wash Processed Panama from Rogue Wave Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Rogue Wave, based out of Edmonton, Alberta, and this coffee was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video as part of a viewer subscriber recommendation suggestion series where it finished second place out of 7 coffees on that day. And one of the biggest takeaways I had from that video was, even in a blind setting, Panamanian coffees perform exceptionally well for me, and that's not too surprising given that I've said for a very long time that Panamanian coffees are my favorite coffees in the entire world. And I gotta give massive credit to Rogue Wave for even offering a standard washed Panamanian coffee on their website, as for whatever reason, they've become increasingly rare and hard to find these days. And this is actually only our second ever standard washed Panamanian coffee review on the channel. We reviewed so many Panamanian geishas, but given just how rare these coffees are to find, this one right here is a pretty unique review in itself for that reason. And I get super excited to discuss Panamanian coffees, as they're not just my favorite coffees, but they're my favorite coffees to discuss in general. Very much looking forward to discussing this one. This right here is day 24 of this coffee. And Rogue Wave does have a brew guide on their website for washed coffees as well, and it's a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 90 degrees Celsius, and I quite liked this recipe. We went with the V60 for this coffee, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile, as we kind of alluded to in the Kenyan review, is a little tricky, because for whatever reason, Canadian coffee seems a little bit more developed than most of the American coffee roasters I do consume, with the exception of Luna, of course. So I think that this is kind of standard light medium Canadian for the roast profile, even if that is a little shade more developed than what I experience from most American coffee roasters. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 9, first impression, that blind taste test day, and the coffee did perform exceptionally well. It was one of the sweetest cups of coffee on that table and had a really kind of soft, nice stone fruit finish to the cup of coffee. And as a result, it was a pretty ideal first impression. And it did trip me up because I fully expected that Batian to be the sweetest cup of coffee on the table. But this one was actually, on that day, the sweetest cup that I had experienced. So that's always going to be a huge positive and a really nice start to any coffee. Day 11, not quite as good on the second impression, and we brewed this one through the Chemex, and this is one of the main reasons we preferred the V60 with this coffee. And it felt so slightly grainy, a bit savory, and just kind of roasty in general. Now, when we brewed it on this day, we went with the higher temperatures because our standard recipe is 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And as I kind of mentioned, just a little bit more developed than I think I'm used to drinking. Most coffees work really well with that temperature, but this one right here just didn't necessarily bring out to the best in this cup of coffee. So we went back on day 12, lowered the temperatures, and adjusted to Rogue Wave's recipe. We were experiencing the best we had experienced from this coffee to this point, as it does cut down on a lot of the kind of smoky grain. And now we're experiencing a lot more of this kind of savory tea and honey-like cup. There's a very herbal, savory tea component to this cup of coffee. The honey, the most pronounced it's been, a bit of the floral honey, and it's a really pretty cup in general. So really positive impression on day 12. Day 13 went back through the Chemex to run it at those lower temperatures to see if we might get some better results, and it's just not quite as lively in the Chemex. It does seem to strip away a lot of the really nice, sweeter components to this cup of coffee. Lighter base with a slightly savory undertone, better as it cools down and as you get more of that kind of floral cookie sweetness. From this point forward, that kind of floral cookie sweetness is the most pronounced characteristic to this cup of coffee, and it is one of my favorite components to this cup of coffee. I really did enjoy that. It's something I've experienced from so many of Calendar's coffees. Day 16, the best day of the cup of coffee to this point as we ran it back through the V60 and getting plenty of depth and much more pronounced of these stone fruits as the cup does cool down. It's got two really kind of dominant components for me. It's got that kind of sweet that sweet floral cookie taste to it, but then at the same time it has that kind of herbal savory tea-like to it. They're almost in about equal parts, but then after that you experience some really wonderful fruits as the cup does cool down. Day 18 cup, I mentioned, really nice as it does cool down, has so many of those stone fruits, but you'd have to wait for the cup of coffee to kind of get like at a room temperature. That's when it does open up a lot more in those floral aspects, in those fruity aspects. It still does continue to radiate that honey floral cookie-like sweetness, and it's just a really sweet cup of coffee in general. Day 21, cup has been really consistent throughout, with the floral honey sweetness and the herbal tea dominating the cup while being complemented by a variety of softer fruit components, those ranging from a fair bit of that stone fruit as the cup does cool down to even a little bit of the citrus fruit. And they have a white grape flavor note listed on here, and you'll see that charted in the tasting wheel, as you do get a fair bit of that. Everything that they have listed on this bag, I got at one point or another. Most distinctly, they have that chamomile as well as the honey. Those were the two factors that I experienced the most. But they also have a nectarine, a grapefruit, and a white grape on there. And you can experience all those flavors in addition to that really strong sweetness throughout the time drinking this cup of coffee. There's a lot of depth to it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 3 level 4s, so let's run through those real quick. The sweetness at a level 4 and the acidity at a level 2, I just wanted to highlight those two together because that's very reminiscent of so many of Sweet Bloom's tasting wheels that we've had before. So that's one of my favorite aspects of this tasting wheel, is that you had high sweetness, low acidity, and that's one of my favorite things for coffee. So credit on that right there. I think the sweetness is definitely deserved and justified at that level 4. Finish, level 4, it doesn't have the most lasting finish out there, but it's such a soft and pleasant finish that it does kind of linger throughout. I would give it a level 4. I think it's justified there. And the cleanliness at a level 4, it is a washed Panamanian coffee. That's not too surprising. I think maybe on the slightly lower side of the level 4, but it's definitely warranted at that mark. Here's where the rest of the tasting wheel gets pretty tricky though in general, as I would say that with the exception of that kind of sweeter cookie taste, there was nothing that justified a really high level 4 mark. As I mentioned, the kind of herbal tea, which we charted in that savory side, is at the level 3. That's the secondary most pronounced characteristic to it. And then you have the florals, as kind of mentioned, floral honey, very pronounced throughout the time drinking this cup of coffee as well, also at a level 3. So those are going to be the next highest marks. They're both on the higher side of the level 3 and definitely higher than the citrus and stone fruit, which were very much kind of tertiary components to this cup of coffee. And we kind of mentioned that there was an ever so slight grape. That's why that's at a level 2. But the biggest thing to kind of highlight about this tasting wheel is that smokiness at a level 3, because I could just not shake the smokiness that was coming from this cup of coffee. And I've been highlighting that a lot, that this coffee just is pushing the spectrum a little bit more on that developed side of things. So as a result, the smokiness just remains kind of higher than I think I was necessarily expecting. Now, given when we made some adjustments, it really cut down on a lot of the smokiness. There were times where the smokiness was really strong and pronounced in this cup of coffee, especially at the higher temperatures, especially off of brew. So that's why it's charted where it is. But for the most part, I quite like the way that this tasting wheel looks. I think it's a pretty good representation of what we were experiencing, especially with the brew guide that they provided. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. So we're going to start with the good, because I have some really nice things to say about this coffee. And the first thing I want to say is, as I kind of mentioned, I think Panamanian coffees are so amazing. I think that this is a wonderful coffee in general. So credits to Rogue for picking out this coffee in the first place, offering this coffee. And again, I just genuinely wish more coffee roasters would offer standard washed Panamanian coffees on their website. And here's the kind of negative component about this coffee. I'm kind of frustrated with how much potential there actually was in this cup of coffee. I feel like if it was just a shade lighter, this would be one of those really special coffees where I would say this is going straight on my honorable mentions list. But that smokiness was a slight bit of a sticking point to me. This was still by far, by a huge distance, my second favorite coffee from those 7 that we put in that blind taste test video. And it's not even close. So it was a really nice coffee in that sense, but I just can't help but feel and wonder what would really happen if this coffee was maybe just a shade less developed. If it was a shade lighter, then if I was getting all these aspects, maybe in a little bit more highlighted of a sense, maybe a little bit more acidity and stuff, just how good this cup of coffee would have been. But that's just my preference. My preferences have been skewing towards a little bit more light coffees in general. So it's just the way I feel about this coffee. But if we kind of take those two things together, I still think it was a really nice experience and definitely significantly better than the previous experience I had from Rogue Wave. So I'll say good coffee in general. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I kind of want to say almost everybody that likes washed coffees. If you've never had a standard washed Panamanian coffee, please go out and try a standard washed Panamanian coffee. So you can hear I'm just raving about them. This one may have been a little bit more on the developed side of things for me, but even then, I still really enjoyed that cup of coffee, and I think that just goes to show how much I enjoy Panamanian coffees, how enjoyable Panamanian coffees are in general. So for the most part, I think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Rogue Wave, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Carmen wash processed Panama from Rogue Wave Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.